Everyone talks about breaking generational cycles, or more popularly known as generational trauma. But very few consider what it actually feels like when you put in the effort to do that. And not just put in the effort, but what does it take to actually achieve it, to accomplish it? Because the majority of the conversations that I come across when it comes to generational trauma and generational cycles is focused on judging the previous generations, judging our parents, judging our grandparents, whatever it is. But we're always judging about how it is that it was so toxic, it was so abusive, it was so dysfunctional and everything else. And that's why we're going to do better. And enter stage gentle parenting. And that's the problem, you see. We go from one extreme to the other extreme because we don't understand. We just know what it is that we don't want. And this is one of the biggest problems that people face in life, is if you come from an environment or background that is less than optimal, and I'm being euphemistic about this because for good reason. We all have an emotional attachment to how it is that we feel about our background, our origins, right? And talking about backgrounds, one of my favorite quotes about that is something I came across about a year ago. It said something to the effect that up until a point we talk about our background. We came from a poor background, we came from an abusive background, toxic background, all of that. But when you reach the age of 30, you become that background for someone else. And too many of us don't realize that part. We don't realize that in all our judgment and all our focus and fixation on everyone that got things wrong and everyone that didn't do us well and didn't do right by us and all of that, we lose sight of the fact that while we are fixated on that, we're also not doing right by someone else that presently has an expectation from us, a legitimate expectation. And that's where things get complicated. And that's where things get interesting. Because that's when we decide how we're going to be different, we're going to be better, we're not going to be like them, and all of those things. And that's where the generational trauma thing comes from, right? I am like this because this is what I experienced when I was young and all of that. And yes, there's merit to that, there's legitimacy to that. But it doesn't stop there. If you stop at that point and then you just like try your hardest, it doesn't change the fact that you don't know how to be better than that. Because that's your point of reference. That's all you know. And that's where people go wrong. People go wrong in wanting to try harder. We want to do better. But they don't realize that you can't do better or try harder and have more effective outcomes if you don't understand what it is that you're dealing with or why it is that you're dealing with it. So when it comes to generational trauma and generational cycles, I hate the word trauma. It's so abused. It's so, pardon the pun, but it's so flippantly thrown around these days. Every unpleasant experience is considered to be trauma. And that's why we've lost this depth of emotional expression and emotional experience. Because we've conditioned ourselves into believing that if something is unpleasant, it's abusive. You're denying me something, you're treating me badly or abusively, or you're toxic and all of that nonsense. It's not that. We've become lazy. I've said this before. We've become lazy in how it is that we want to express ourselves and how it is that we want to understand where someone else is coming from. So back to the whole perception thing and generational trauma, because that's what it's all about. When we talk about generational cycles, we're talking about our perception of what did or didn't work, but we don't consider what it is that informs our perception. Now, I can tell you with a fair amount of confidence that the majority of people these days who are operating as adults, and I use that term lightly, or operating as parents, and I use that term lightly as well, is because most parents are trying to be friends these days. You're not a friend, you're a parent. There's a very distinct difference between the two, very distinct expectation that changes between the two. But anyway, most people who operate in that way these days, the majority of the wisdom and the information that they're working with is gained from social media. Ta-da! There's your problem. We look at the way others think life is supposed to be, and then we compare that because it looks better than what we've got, right? We look at it and we think, yeah, that if only our family was like that, and if only my life was like that, and things like that. We look at that, and then we think, you guys didn't do that, so you guys were the problem. We don't have that, so that's the problem. And that's not what it's about. That's not what breaking generational cycles are about. Because you can achieve the exact same outcome, emotional development outcome. And I'm being very specific about the words emotional development, because that's what it's about, right? So how you develop someone's emotional capacity is very different to how you give them skills. So teaching someone how to navigate life in a practical, methodical kind of way, that's not building up their emotional capacity. That's just giving them confidence in being able to deal with certain situations. And that's where you end up with people becoming so overly confident because of their competence to deal with certain situations in certain settings, that when things don't go the way they need it to go, they collapse, they implode, they explode, they become completely problematic in their behavior and selfish and all of that. And then we start calling them narcissists and all sorts of things. And they start calling us toxic and all sorts of things. And that's how it goes, right? Because we're so focused on how we must do things that we don't understand why it's important in the first place. We don't understand what's the consequence of doing it. We don't understand one critically important point, which is that how we go about doing something, how we go about providing or nurturing or caring or supporting. The how is what creates the impact of the emotional experience. Now, here's the thing. If we focus on the how, we're not going to be focused on the outcome. So we're going to think, well, I did everything I can, so that means you must be the problem because you're not taking what I'm giving you. You're not respecting my advice, my input, whatever it is. And to some degree, there's some truth to that. But when we're talking about minors, children, younger ones, early teens, that sort of thing, before they get to the point of believing they know it all. When we're talking about that age group, then we need to realize that if they're not listening, if they're not taking our lead and following our guidance and implementing our advice, it's not necessarily because they choose not to, it's because they're just not connecting with it the way we think they should. Which means we have to review our delivery, our way of connecting with them, our way of imparting that knowledge, whether we're participating with them or are we sitting back and instructing them while our actions might conflict with what it is that we're asking them to do. And that's where it gets complicated again, because that's what breaking generational cycles looks like. It looks like you figuring out how to achieve something better without knowing how. Because remember, if you want to break a generational cycle, if you think that there was some toxic trait in your family history that you don't want to pass on to your children, all you know is that you don't want to do it that way. But you don't know how to achieve what it is that you want to achieve except through what you see others doing. So that looks like an easy thing, copy paste. Take it from someone else, see how they're doing it, and if that works, it should work for us. But there's so many things that are different about the two scenarios, about who you're taking it from and where you're trying to implement it. And one of the things that's different about those scenarios is the fact that the environment in which you see it working for someone else is very different from your environment. Completely different. No matter how similar your backgrounds might be, there's certain nuances, there's certain innuendos and unique attributes and facts about your life that is different from theirs. Who you are compared to who they are. How the people around you perceive you compared to how they perceive them. All of those things are different. And if you don't consider that, you're going to assume that you're right because you did what someone else is clearly successful at doing to achieve the same outcome, which means that the people you're trying to do it with, they obviously just uncooperative or problematic, or they're the issue. It's not you. And that's where the stress and duress and everything else comes in, because then we make assumptions based on those outcomes. When we try to achieve something and we don't achieve it, we then start making assumptions about our significance and how it is that we respect it. Now, respect is another interesting thing, because whether or not someone is respecting your role versus how they respect you is not necessarily one and the same thing. Also, just because your role is respected doesn't mean you are respected. Look at the president of the free world right now. That gives you an interesting kind of example of exactly how mainstream mental health goes completely wrong. But seriously though, that's the issue, right? The issue is that we don't understand context. We don't look beyond the surface. Everything is very surface level. You see a certain video clip, you see a little episode or something or the other on social media or wherever it is that you find it, and you think, aha, that's how it's supposed to be. And then you go and you try to implement it. But you don't realize that there's a lot of things they're not telling you about, which is why I don't like to emphasize how we must go about fixing things. Because we're human and we're dealing with humans. We're not dealing with business processes. We're not dealing with things that have predictability about them, and rigid predictability. You throw a ball against the wall, it bounces off in a certain direction relative to the angle at which you threw it against the wall. The force you use, if you use the same force each time, it will bounce off in the same way, unless there's degradation in the quality of the ball's elasticity and all of that. And that's how it gets complicated. And that's how it is that the more you understand about those variables that change and shift and are volatile and are not fixed, the more you understand and are aware of that, the more it is that you'll be able to adapt your approach. So let's use that ball as an example again. So say I'm using a tennis ball, right? And everyone knows, or not everyone, but most people who used tennis balls or played with tennis balls would know that after a while, it just bounces less than a brand new ball. And you'll notice this the moment you can take out a brand new ball from its packaging and you bounce that, versus an old ball that is already weathered and worn and doesn't even have any of the fluff left on it. And you bounce that and you can see there's a clear difference in the way they perform. And that's the understanding that we need to have, is that things do degrade and things change and there's other factors that come into effect. And if we don't consider these things, we're going to keep focusing on our method. Why? Because we need to be appreciated for our effort, for our contribution, not what's the effectiveness or the outcome of our efforts and contributions, but we, as in the person who is doing it, needs to be appreciated for doing it, not for whether or not they achieved it. And that's the problem, is that we then become defined by whether or not we achieve it. But because, again, we're dealing with humans, we have reason to blame them for not cooperating, for blaming them for being difficult or not wanting to do things and all of that. All it means is that at some point you need to realize what someone else is invested in versus what you're invested in. So coming back to the generational cycle thing, how does it actually look? How do you actually experience the lived experience of breaking generational cycles? Well, for starters, like I've tried to explain so far, it's not a clean-cut process. It's not something you just wake up and read a book about it or watch a couple of clips and decide this is how we're going to do things differently. That's a starting point, but that's where the trial and error comes in. The moment you're doing something differently, you need to remember that the people you are working with on trying to change things, they have a different frame of reference from you. They're looking at it in the way that it might have been looked at before, because that's normal. Generational cycles, they pass down because that's normalized behavior. It's normalized traditions and customs that might have been outgrown, or times have changed, and it then results in it becoming a hindrance to having a good quality of life rather than establishing that quality of life that you're supposed to have. And that's why we then lose sight of why it is that something that was actually good, we might have experienced it as bad. We might have experienced it as bad because relative to what we expected or what we needed to be able to deal with this new reality that has developed since the last generation were in their prime years, that reality is different. And that's why it's Ali radiallahu anh, one of the Muslim leaders of the early days, who said that don't expect your children, or don't raise your children to the way you were raised, because they were created for a time different from yours. And if anything captures, I think, generational cycles that need to change, that captures it. Captures it beautifully, because it gives you understanding of the fact that you're raising your children to operate in a world that has moved on from the world that you had when you were their age. So if you're going to try to implement parenting styles and parenting approaches and advices in exactly the same way that your parents approached it with you, you're losing the plot. not losing it, you've lost it. Because you'll have a kind of a certain hit ratio where you'll have some success, and then there'll be a whole lot of things that you will have absolutely no impact on, and you won't know why. It's because, for example, one of my best examples, the favorite examples that I like to use is when we were kids, right? Gen X, so we're talking 70s, 80s children. If we had to be told by our parents that this is the way something is done, all right, and we wanted to rebel, so we went around the corner and we decided to do something other than the way our parents told us to do it, the way we're supposed to behave, how we're supposed to carry ourselves, what is an acceptable level of rowdiness in public, that sort of thing, right? If we went around the corner and we went against what our parents told us, chances are very good that there was an uncle around the corner or an aunt around the corner. And when I say uncle or aunt, I'm not talking of relatives. I'm talking of anyone in the community who was an elder or an adult. We saw them as uncles and aunts, right? So, or aunties, to be more accurate. So the point is, chances are they would then reprimand us for the same reason that our parents would have reprimanded us if they were present. Which means that the village had one voice, more or less, right? But it's that consistency of the voice of the village, of the people around us, that gave us reason to believe that, okay, that's the way it works. Now, you tell your child, this is the way it works. Not only do we not have those aunts and uncles in the neighborhood, because everyone has become so insular in the way they live these days, and we're all scared of shouting someone else's child because, these days you actually have to be afraid of a lawsuit against you. That's how frivolous we've become as a society. But beside that, the problem we've got is that chances are other people, other adults around you don't have a vested interest in how your child is behaving. They're more inclined to judge them and reject them than they are to want to embrace them and correct them, right? And that's the problem. You can't rely on the voice of the village anymore. So what defines the village these days? The village is no longer the people around you. The village is social media. The village is the global village. It's dysfunctional for the most part. But that's what you're competing with as a parent. So when you want to be able to impart a certain wisdom or a certain understanding to your children, you can't do it within the context of how you grew up with it. You have to do it within the context of how they're growing up with it. So you have to be able to almost extract the wisdom from what it is that you experience with your parents, what it is that you saw them doing that might have raised you to have a certain ethic and a certain value system. And you have to understand within the context of contemporary times and what your children are currently actively exposed to as far as their reality is concerned, how do you connect that value system or that principle or that ethic to their experiences so that they can recognize why it's beneficial, why it's important. And that's what we lose sight of. Getting that right requires us to be actively engaged and aware and understanding of contemporary social challenges for their age group and what it is that we are allowing them to be exposed to. So if we just plant them on the couch or in their room and say, I've got work to do, you can sit on your phone or sit on your tablet or sit on your PC or your laptop or whatever it is, and we have no idea what it is that they're consuming, what it is that they're exposed to, we won't understand why it is that when we say one, they say no. They don't even say two. They just say no. Because we've exposed them to value systems that we have no idea of. And when we expose them to those value systems that we just completely oblivious to, we can't hide behind the excuse that it's technology and, I'm not very tech savvy and all of that nonsense. It's not an excuse anymore. That's like someone saying that, I just don't really find myself into academics, so I didn't really bother to learn how to read and write. So you can't blame me for not knowing what it is that my children are reading. It's irresponsible. So living the challenge of breaking generational cycles, or even trying to sustain certain generational cycles, because some things are good about the previous generations, right? If it wasn't, we wouldn't be here having the kind of privilege and the kind of opportunity that we have, because there was goodness in a lot of what they did. And that's part of the problem of looking at previous generations from a judgmental perspective and thinking toxic this and abusive that. Because there's not a single parent who puts in an effort for their children. And I mean put in an effort, even minimal effort. But they're actually present and they're putting in an effort. Who actively, consciously, deliberately tries to do less for their children than what their parents did for them. At the minimum, they're trying to replicate what they received from their parents. But more often than not, they're trying to do better than that. But that's where we go wrong, or that's where we generally lose the plot, is when we try to do better, but we don't understand what it took for our parents to actually do what they did in the first place. That made it possible for us to be able to see things with more clarity and more understanding than they did, or with greater opportunity and greater wisdom and ways of being able to do more with what we've got. So you have to see both the previous generation, your generation, and the next generation within the context of how they're experiencing life. You know, it's similar to how it is that they say that no two children experience the same parents, because, or they say they're not raised by the same parents. And that's because no two children would have experienced their parents in the same way, because parents would have changed relative to having one child, two children, three children, and so on, right? So with every child that the parents have, who they are fundamentally as individuals, as humans, as parents, changes. So the first child will experience a much more stricter view of the parents because they're trying to get everything right. They're protecting them from all the risks and the harms and everything else. And the second child gets a slightly less intense version of the parents because now the parents feel a bit more comfortable at ease. So they're willing to take more chances and they're willing to trust more in their judgment, in their discretion. Third child, even more. So then the first and the second child, they're the ones that the parents kind of cut their teeth on and pardon the pun again. And they're the ones that the parents learnt the ropes about parenting. So they take it even more easy with the third child, and then the first two look at it and think, that our youngest sibling gets away with everything and we had it so tough. And that's how it is that no two children experience the same parents. Now, if that's true for our children with us, it's also true for our experiences with our parents. And that's where generational cycles become difficult to navigate. Because what we see as a generational cycle, another sibling might not experience it the same way. We might have experienced things in one way, in one light, and we might have had good reason to experience it that way because parents, the good ones, will try to be even and fair and consistent with all their children. But those changes of who they are, that will automatically change it. And also remember, it gets really complicated because of the practicality of life, not because it is a complicated issue. And this is the awareness that we need to develop, right? One of the reasons that it complicates things is because the way in which the firstborn would have experienced certain things before the secondborn came along would have been very different to experiencing the same thing in the same way while there's a secondborn present. Because now there's a point of comparison. And if when children are young, when they're toddlers and when they are tweens and things like that, they don't have the presence of mind to understand why it is that there's a warranted difference in the way parents approach the one child compared to the other child, because they're different levels of development and understanding and awareness, right? So that's where this sense of justice or injustice is developed in those early days when we believe that we're being treated differently from our siblings. But nonetheless, we still move on to wanting to break generational cycles. Now, all of these things that I'm mentioning that seem like peripheral kind of other issues relating to how we want to raise our children, it's critically important to understand it because within that context, that's the reality you're navigating. That's what you need to understand differently. That's why you need to be able to look with understanding, or at least with an effort towards achieving understanding, rather than looking with judgment. So if you look at your parents and you think you know better than them, and you think that if you were them, you wouldn't have done certain things a certain way and all of that, maybe you're right. But guess what? You're not them, and you weren't there, and you didn't have their background and their understanding and their demons and their limitations and their struggles and their relationship with their parents and their relationship with society, etc., etc., etc. None of that was true for you. So judging is just a convenient indulgence of our ego. That's it. Unless you genuinely intend to first judge whether it's good or bad, right or wrong, effective or ineffective, that sort of thing, but you're intending to make that judgment call because you want to do something with it, then it's purposeful towards an outcome. So you judge whether it's something that was good and you think, yeah, I like that, so I need to figure out how it is that they managed to achieve that so that I can apply that knowledge and wisdom and understanding in my engagement with my children so that I can get them to appreciate the same value, like gratefulness or respect, not good manners, respect. Another thing that we completely ignore the difference of. And that's another thing that also contributes to how we understand generational cycles. Good manners, being polite, saying please and thank you, those are just mannerisms, those are just etiquettes. Respect is appreciating the value of the role that someone plays. Respecting the individual, the human within that role and their proximity to you, their relationship to you. Respect is very different from just good manners. And that's why you've got no shortage of people who are well-mannered but extremely disrespectful when it comes to actual interaction and engagement and listening and the way they phrase things and the way they talk to others, where they might be condescending towards elders and they don't realize it because it's like, hey, I'm allowed to have my opinion and my thoughts and my emotions, and it needs to be respected. And that's where you lose the plot again when it comes to the whole generational cycle thing. So generational cycles, when you actually start pushing back and when you start changing and challenging and all of that, that's where you really experience the grit and the reality of what breaking generational cycles is all about. Because then you get the resistance, you get the judgment in return. You think you know better, you think you're too good, you think you're better than us, you think you're better than them, you think you're better than your parents, all of those sorts of things. That's the kind of thing that you start facing. So in an ideal world, everyone in a specific family unit, all the siblings and their children and their partners, would all be on the same page that these generational cycles need to be broken for these reasons, and this is how we collaborate to be able to do better than that. That's not what happens in reality. In reality, everyone's got their own demons, because remember, everyone experienced their parents differently. One might think they were the best thing ever, and the other one might think that they were the worst thing ever. One might think that they were fair, and the other one might think that they had favorites. One might think that they were well-grounded and wise humans who imparted a lot of knowledge and wisdom to us, and the other one might think that they were completely absent. And if you don't have meaningful relationships and conversations with each other in the family unit, in the extended family unit, to have those conversations, and to understand why it's entirely possible for one to experience their parents completely different to the other, your efforts to break generational cycles becomes that much more difficult. But it gets more complicated than that, because let's assume that you have got a good grasp on it, but the others just don't get it because they don't have the capacity or the awareness or the understanding, or they have other priorities in their life because they're still distracted or something. Then it becomes even more difficult, because then breaking the generational cycles looks like rejection, isolation, ridicule, condescension, judgment, all sorts of things. It looks like fighting against the tide all the time, pushing against the flow of things all the time, having to explain yourself repeatedly to your children, to your partner, to your siblings, to other extended family members or people in your support structure, whatever it is. That's what it looks like. And that is not for the faint of heart. But everyone these days, well, I say everyone with a pinch of salt, but a lot of people these days who think they're there to break generational cycles, they're not prepared for that. They're not even equipped to deal with that, because they're convinced that they're just doing better than their parents because of the bitterness and the anger with which they actually view their parents or their relationship with their parents. As long as you're bitter and you're angry, as long as you're oblivious or deliberately avoidant is a new hot term in the mainstream mental health space. Oh, it's another abused term. But as long as you're generally avoiding facing facts or wanting to criticize the elders or see them as complete humans rather than just seeing them as elders and things like that, as long as you're not able to have a mature, grounded, healthy discussion about it without feeling as if you're maligning them, as if you are making them look bad or something, if you don't have that capacity, you are and you will repeat mistakes that you think you won't make, that they made. And the reason for that is because when you don't know why, you just recreate the same problem in a different way. That's it. And because you're not looking for the problem you're creating, you're looking at your method in how it is that you're trying to do it differently, or you're trying not to repeat the same mistakes. You're going to focus on that. You're going to focus on, but I didn't do that. I didn't treat you that way. I didn't raise you the way I was raised. I didn't beat you up the way I was beaten up. I didn't. All of those things. We make those comparisons between how our parents did it versus how we're doing it, and we think that's enough. It's not enough. If there's anything that we have as a gripe with our parents, it would be because we felt misunderstood by them. We felt as if they didn't see us. We felt as if they didn't really get what was important to us. Solve that problem with your own children. Do you understand them? Do you understand what's important to them? Do you understand why it is that they are holding on to demons that you just don't see why they have any reason to have in the first place? Do you have that view of your children? Or are you so focused on your children respecting you and respecting your authority and doing things better and appreciating the opportunities you're giving them that you didn't have and all of that? Every single time, without fail, not a single exception, of every person and every case study and every client that I ever worked with who had difficulties with substance abuse or other addictive behaviors, it was because they felt as if who they were was insignificant to their father. Simple. That's not complicated. Understanding why it is that we were or we weren't, whether we were insignificant or not, or whether we did matter or we didn't matter, or whether even if we didn't matter, do we still not matter right now? Those are the kinds of answers that we need to look for. Not the methods, not the people play things playgrounds and all of that nonsense. That's not what gets us to move on from addictive behaviors or move on from our personal demons. Our personal demons are slayed through understanding how we adopted them in the first place. That's what breaking generational cycles looks like, where you don't just blindly follow because that's the way we've always done it, but you look at what was the wisdom behind it originally being done, and then you try to recreate the value of that method in a contemporary way because it serves the same purpose. Like, for example, this is a contentious one, but maybe we can finish off on this one. In the old days, family gatherings was the thing, right? So that was something that had significant weight and impetus and importance about it. And that family gatherings would then happen at specific intervals or in a specific setting or at specific venues, specific members of the family or the big house and things like that. That's what, at least where we come from, there was someone in the family was identified as the big house, and it's usually the house where the parents lived, right? So if that's the big house and the family gatherings always happen there, then that would become then the space in which the family would be cohesive, would develop their cohesion as a family unit. These days, it's been replaced by WhatsApp groups and social media followings and sharing reels and things like that. What's the problem with that? It doesn't have that meaningful interaction and engagement anymore. More so, it creates the opportunity to not engage while being a participant. It creates the opportunity to be invisible, or to leave, or to just not actively engage or participate. I think I've said that already, but can you see the problem is that the more convenient we make these gatherings and things like that, like the outsourcing of the efforts to make it a good experience and things like that, because like who has time to prepare things these days when you can just pay someone to prepare it for you and you can just enjoy the time? No, we've lost the plot. All of these things that we are abandoning because of convenience, because life is so tough, because we have so much pressure and all of that, that's where we lose it. because we assume that the pressure we have is something we can't do anything about. We just have to accept it, and we must try and make everything else kind of line up because of that pressure that we have. And that's how we look for easy solutions and convenient outcomes. The thing that brings people together and keeps them together is when they struggle together, when they grow together, when they build together, when they engage together, when they participate together. Not in digital realms, not in virtual realities, not on social media, not on sharing images and sharing memes and sharing reels. That has its place, but that has to complement the essence and the substance of the relationships you have. It can't be the main kind of factor that determines whether you're still in touch and whether you still share something. WhatsApp groups have probably destroyed more family unity and family cohesiveness than what it's actually enhanced, because it creates a very real audit trail, fact-based evidence that you can look at, and you can then gauge who is invested in your contribution and who isn't, who is favorites and who are not, because that's when you see the differences in how people react with enthusiasm to some members of the family and less enthusiasm towards others. And those sorts of things, they set very subtle kind of nuanced messages in the family unit that then breaks it up, because it's like, okay, well, if I'm not one of the popular ones, why should I participate? And you have the option not to participate because it's a digital space, right? So the more we lose sight of the importance of actual physical presence in each other's lives, active participation, the more it is that we will make the same mistakes in a different way. Because what kept things grounded in the past was that physical presence in each other's life. And when you lose that, you're then left with a small nucleus family that has very little by way of extended support structures. And the families who have a healthy extended support structure between family members that goes beyond the immediate kind of responsibilities, those are the ones that thrive the most. Those are the ones that have the lowest chronic illnesses and the lowest mental duresses and all of that sort of thing, because you feel like you're part of a supported, safe, cohesive, embracing structure. That's the village. So if you want to break generational cycles, you have to look at your village. You can't just look at how you want to parent. And whether or not any of this lands, I don't know. But what I do know is that the way we're going about doing it in the mainstream is wrong. It's not sustainable, and it's creating new problems. And we can see the new problems it's creating because we're getting more hyper-individualized in our approach to life rather than community-focused or socially bonded in our approach to life. And that in itself, that rejection, that exclusion, that distance that we create as a result of that just wears us out. It doesn't build us up. So if you want to break generational cycles, start with trying to understand why it is that the previous generation did what they did before you want to judge them and try to do things differently. And if you're not actively contributing towards creating the good outcomes that you might have inherited from those previous generations in your childhood and in your years of before becoming a parent, if you're not actively contributing towards establishing that in the current context of your life with your children and your extended families, then guess what? You are a generational cycle that the next generation is going to need to break. Or they're going to just surrender to it because they're going to feel completely powerless to break it. So remember, the day you become a parent, you become that background that someone is growing up with. How are they going to talk about you? Take care.